This statue has been one of my best friends because I saw him first in Venice, then I saw him again in Berlin, then I saw him in Athens, and then I finally went to Motya to take a look, and yesterday I saw him in the British Museum, and I'm delighted to say I am going to the Getty, and so I will see him yet again. So I'm following in his footsteps. There will be a little bit of overlapping in my paper, but because it will lead to an argument, so please bear with me. I would like to add just that the statue is made of Parian marble, and I think this has some bearing on what I'm going to say. And we've already heard about its fine spot in Motya and the destruction which was caused by Syracuse, by Dionysius I of Syracuse. And here is the fine spot. I took this photograph about a year ago in Motya. And this is the sanctuary of Capitatu, where the statue was perhaps standing before it was removed to be used in the fortifications. Now, because of his long chiton and youthful appearance, the statue is often identified as a charioteer, but I think this is despite his pose, which makes it impossible for him to stand on a chariot. Comparison with the pose of the Delphi charioteer, who holds out the horse's reins, and with charioteers on silver coins of Syracuse of the 5th century, illustrate the obvious differences in the pose. The aim of my paper is to explore the identity and function of the Motya youth, and I will attempt to investigate whether he was an agonistic dedication or whether he formed part of a memorial of military victory rather than athletic victory. He stands with right leg bent, left hand on hip, right arm raised, and head bent to his left. His oblique position gives him an air of restlessness and creates the impression that he did not stand alone. I think he was part of a group. He wears a long, clinging, sleeveless chiton, which is girded high on the chest, with a broad belt tied with a cord. 2 holes in the center of the belt served for the attachment of the metallic ends of this cord, and in fact, we do have a little pin on the right, which served for this attachment. His hairstyle consists of 3 rows of curls over the forehead and 2 rows over the nape of the neck. The top and rear of the head are roughly worked with a point. He wore an added headgear, which was supported by 2 nails at the back, 2 nails in front, which are now lost, we only have the holes, and an additional metal support on top of the head. The fact that the statue is finished in the round indicates that it could be viewed from all sides. Even though it was found in a Phoenician site, it appears to be the work of a Greek sculptor. The contrast with Phoenician works from Motya makes this obvious. They're not marble to begin with. We don't have any other marble works from the island. The question arises whether his iconography is purely Greek or whether he was commissioned by a Phoenician patron in order to function in a Phoenician environment. And both cases have been argued. There is also a minority view that the statue was commissioned by one of the few Greeks that lived on Motya and was dedicated in a local Greek sanctuary. The evidence for Greek presence in Motya is transmitted through Diodorus Siculus, but it is not so far borne out by the archaeological data. We will consider the various possibilities, beginning with questions of chronology and style. Most scholars date the Motya youth to the decade 480 to 470 BC and place him in the early phase of the severe style. The closest stylistic parallel comes from Athens. On the right, you see the head of a youth from the Kerameikos cemetery, which is also of Parian marble, and which head belonged to a funerary statue. This statue is usually interpreted as a casualty of the Persian Wars of 480-479, and it is thought to have been erected just before the Athenian ban on funerary monuments. The youth's long, transparent chiton without sleeves is unique for male statuary in this period. The parallel, flat, linear folds are reminiscent of female chitons, and also the lack of sleeves, that can be seen on a number of severe style reliefs recently attributed to a Parian workshop on the strength of a grave relief that came to light on Paros and is illustrated on your right. Two reliefs in Parian marble, attributed to the same workshop, are actually now in Rome, where they must have been removed from their original locations by the Romans. On the right, you see the so-called Roukothea relief in the Villa Albani, and the relief from the Esqui line is now in the Conservatory Museum on the left. And they're all very similar, and I think also very similar to the Motya youth. The Motya youth has been tentatively attributed either to the sculptor Pythagoras of Rhegion, even though the artist's style is completely unknown, or to an Athenian master by comparison with the head in the Kerameikos. However, the Kerameikos head does not have to be by an Athenian. Several sculptor signatures from Athens in the early 5th century indicate the presence of sculptors from various origins, especially from the islands of the Aegean, and therefore this head doesn't have to be Athenian. Because the Motya statue is unique for South Italy and Sicily, I think it is more likely the product of an itinerant Parian workshop that was also responsible for the reliefs that are now in Rome. The rough-picked head, framed by rows of curls, can be found not only in the Kerameikos head that we just saw, and you can see it on the upper left hand of the screen, we can also find it in the late archaic funerary statues of Aristodikos on the bottom of the screen. Both the Kerameikos head and Aristodikos are thought to have worn bronze helmets. And you can see a reconstruction of Aristodikos with the Corinthian helmet at the bottom. It is quite likely that the Motya youth also wore a bronze helmet, especially considering that the upper surface of his ears is flat and rough-picked in order to support a metallic headgear. But other headgears have been suggested. He has been restored wearing a Phrygian cap, or a lion skin cap, or a wreath. It has also been proposed that he was holding a wreath in his raised right hand, about to place it on his head. Considering, however, that his head is not inclined towards his right hand, but towards his left hand, I think this idea is impossible. His stance with left hand on hip, right hand raised holding a spear or a scepter, can more profitably be compared to the statue of Inomaus from the east pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. Inomaus wears a helmet and held a spear or a scepter, and he was represented as a warrior, and I think comparison with the Motya youth is very illuminating. Although there is general consensus that the Motya statue was made by a Greek, there are two dominant views concerning its function. According to the first hypothesis, it was commissioned by a Phoenician, in which case the long chiton is probably a priestly garment. Because his idiosyncratic belt does not appear in any other Greek sculptures, it has been interpreted as an oriental belt, by comparison with Assyrian reliefs of the 7th century. On the right, you see a similar belt worn by a soldier in an Assyrian palace relief from Nineveh in the British Museum. However, priests in Phoenician sculpture not only wear long-sleeved garments, but are also shown raising their right hand in prayer, holding a vessel in the left. Those who subscribe to the Phoenician hypothesis identified the youth with the god Melkart or one of his priests. Another suggestion was that he represents Hamilcar, the defeated Carthaginian leader at the Battle of Himera in 480. According to Herodotus, Hamilcar was heroized by the Phoenicians, and they erected memorials for him in Carthage and all its colonies, and therefore in Motya. Memorials, however, do not imply portraits, and the youth's age and transparent dress rule out an identification with Hamilcar. The alternative view is that the Motya youth was a Greek commission, in which case the long chiton is usually explained as a charioteer's dress. But charioteers in long chitons do not wear broad belts like the Motya youth, nor do they stand with one hand on the hip, the other raised on the side, and besides, their chitons have sleeves, unlike the Motya youth. The best contemporary example of a charioteer is the bronze charioteer in Delphi, which differs very much from the Motya statue. A series of silver tetradrachms minted in Syracuse around 470 to 460, representing a charioteer with a broad belt, although not a clinging garment, and with some sleeves, are often cited as evidence of the Motya youth's identity. But the obvious difficulty of erecting the Motya youth on a chariot eventually led to the suggestion that even though he is a charioteer, he did not stand on a chariot, or that he was a groom standing next to a chariot. If the statue is a Greek commission, then it probably reached Motya as war booty. It is generally assumed that it stood in one of the Greek cities of Sicily that were ravaged by the Carthaginians at the end of the 5th century. These invasions were planned as belated reprisals for the crushing victory of the Sicilian Greeks against the Carthaginians at the Battle of Himera in 480. So in 409, Hannibal, setting out from Motya, plundered the Greek cities of Himera and Selinus. In 406, a fleet sailing out from Carthage invaded Agrigento, Akragas. Many sculptures and other artworks were taken to Carthage. In 405, it was the turn of Gela and Camarina to submit to the Carthaginians. When the Romans destroyed Carthage in 146, part of the war booty was returned to Akragas, Gela, and Himera by Scipio Aemilianus. If the Motya youth represents a charioteer, then the statue must have been dedicated by one of the tyrants of Sicily after his victory in a chariot race at a Panhellenic sanctuary between 485 and 470. The dedication must have been located in one of the cities plundered by the Carthaginians. The tyrants of Akragas have been considered the best candidates, and the statue was tentatively located in Akragas. In 476, Theron won the Olympic chariot race, and his brother Xenocrates won the chariot race at Isthmia. The Motya youth has been identified by some with Nicomachos, the charioteer of Xenocrates. The question arises, since the loot from Agrigento ended up in Carthage, why was this statue found in Motya? Only the booty from Himera and Selinus ended up in Motya. We must therefore rule out both Akragas as the original location of the statue and the Akragas tyrants as its patrons. If the Motya youth belong to the booty from Himera or Selinus, then we may well ask, why would the Carthaginians remove the statue of a charioteer? We would rather expect them to pick a work of political significance. An obvious example of this is the group of the tyrannicides that were stolen from Athens by the invading Persian king Xerxes in 480 because it had symbolic value to the Athenian democracy. What if the Motya youth is not a charioteer? To begin with, his oblique placement indicates that he was part of a group, turning to another figure at his proper left. The figure of Inomaus in the east pediment of the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, who has a similar pose, was also part of a larger composition. He was part of a group, as you see in this picture. The youth's long garment has alternatively been interpreted as a hieratic dress, but if he was a priest, he was always thought to be a Carthaginian priest. However, Greek priests also wear a long chiton, except that it is normally not clinging, it has sleeves, and moreover, we have no priests in Greek sculpture before the Parthenon. The bearded man in a long, ungirded chiton in the center of the picture comes from the east frieze of the Parthenon and is generally identified with the Archon Basilius, chief priest of the Athenian democracy. Images of Athenian priests in long chitons also appear on Attic grave reliefs of the late 5th century and the whole of the 4th century. They wear no belts and usually hold a sacrificial knife as a token of their vocation, like on this grave relief in the National Museum in Athens. The belts of the Motya youth has played a crucial role in the figure's identification. But is it really that significant? Setting aside the belt, I would suggest that we consider the dress in a different perspective. The similarity of this dress to female chitons of the severe style has already led to the formation of a minority view that regards him as a transvestite and identifies him with Achilles on Skyros or Adonis or a transvestite priest in ritual dress. Indeed, what if the feminine aspect of his clothing reflects his function? Plutarch reports that Aristandros, Alexander the Great's seer at the Battle of Gaugamela, addressed the troops in female dress. May I also remind you that Tiresias, the famous mythological seer, had a dual nature, having been a woman before he was a man. His powers of divination were increased by insight into the opposite sex. If we restore the Motya youth with the helmet and the spear, by analogy with Inomaus of Olympia, we have the image of a warrior in a long clinging chiton, which is reminiscent of female clothing. I propose to identify him as a seer who distinguished himself in a military campaign. The iconography of seers in Greek art is particularly problematic, and we have no time to go into it. But his young age is not an obstacle. Pausanias mentions a statue of Eperastos, a young victor at the Olympic Games, who was also a professional seer. Military seers were more common than we think. The ancient sources name several seers who not only predicted victory for their commanders, but also took part in the battle. The best known example is Lysander's seer Agias, who foretold his victory at Aegispotami in 405. Agias was honored by having his portrait erected next to that of Lysander in the Naval Commander's Monument in Delphi. Another seer who had his portrait set up next to his commander was Theanetos, who was included in the mid-5th century statuary group of the Athenian general Tolmaides on the Athenian Acropolis. As it happens, seers were very prominent in the campaigns of the Persian Wars. which coincide exactly with the creation of the Motya youth. The seer Megistias stayed by Leonidas' side at the Battle of Thermopylae, even though he knew he was going to die. 3 Greek seers took active part in the Battle of Plataea in 479, one serving the Spartans, another one their opponents, the Thebans, and the third one served the Persians, even though he was Greek. In conclusion, even though we have no record of seers serving the tyrants of Sicily before the mid-4th century, I suggest that the Motya youth could be reconstructed as part of a group alongside a Sicilian tyrant who was victorious not in Panhellenic games, but in battle against the Carthaginians. We have already suggested that the statue must have been set up either in Selinus or in Himera around 480, because it's ended up in Motya, and that's the only 2 cities that offered booty to Motya were Selinus and Himera. The most memorable battle at the time was the crushing victory of Gelo, tyrant of Syracuse, against the Carthaginians at Himera in 480. Gelo's dedications at Himera itself and in the Panhellenic sanctuaries of Delphi and Olympia commemorated his achievement for all time. A statuary group, including him and his seer, set up at Himera is not unlikely. The removal of the seer's statue by the invading Carthaginians in 409 would, of course, be particularly significant. Finally, the wide oriental belt could only be booty from the Carthaginians and need not be a regular feature of the figure's dress, and I think it shouldn't determine the identification of the figure. Thank you very much for your attention.